The alien princess wept for her fallen maid, unaware a human soldier had saved her. The war had ended, but not for Queen Isapare. She stood alone in the valley of Atrismere, where the sky still wept embers from the orbital scars above. The ground beneath her boots was blackened glass, fused by orbital fire and crushed bone, a place no flowers grew and no birds dared sing. Smoke still clung to the ruins like it feared being forgotten, and all around her the silence was not peace but aftermath. A grave marker had been placed there, crude and makeshift, etched not by royal stone crafters, but likely by soldiers retreating from the chaos. On it, carved in trembling alien script, were the words for she who never fled. No name, no rank, just those 6 words and the remnants of a scorched maid's robe draped like faded silk over the stone. It had been enough to stop Iser's heart when her scouts first found it, and now, standing before it, the queen could barely breathe. This wasn't just a loss, this was a theft of closure. The maid who had died here was not just a servant. She had been more faithful than generals, more devoted than blood. Her name had been Elaine, a girl born of nothing, raised in the shadows of the palace walls, who had sworn fealty not to the crown but to the person who wore it. And when the war broke loose and the royal palace became a battleground, it had been Elaine who dragged the queen from the burning throne room, who took a blast meant for her at the eastern gate, who disappeared into the chaos, buying Iser those few precious seconds to escape. For months afterward, Iser had denied her death. She refused to hold a ceremony, refused to speak her name as a eulogy. There had been no body, no confirmation, only the echo of memory and a silence that crushed her ribs every night in bed. But now this grave site, barren and forsaken, whispered a truth she could no longer fight. She knelt beside it, careful not to disturb the burnt fabric, her clawed fingers brushing the edge of the melted sigil once pinned to the maid's chest. Her voice trembled as she spoke. You were supposed to see the peace. You were supposed to wear gold beside me when the throne was restored. I was never a queen without you. I only wore the crown because you made sure it never slipped. Her tears dripped silently onto the grave, absorbed by the dust like rain vanishing into the wounds of the earth. The sky thundered once above her, not with warships now, but with distant weather, the kind of storm that brought only wind and old pain. She stayed like that for hours, until the sun fled behind the ridgeline and the world grew cold again. She left a flower that would never bloom and a silence that would never stop echoing. 2 systems away, on a derelict mining moon forgotten by both sides of the war, a human soldier struggled to keep a dying girl breathing. The war had broken many things in Corporal Mason Drew, his trust in orders, his belief in heroes, and the hearing in his left ear from a missile strike that had shattered the last outpost he called home. But it had not broken his instinct to move toward the sound of suffering. So when the tremble of a voice reached him through cracked gums, buried under rubble and dust, he followed it. He found her beneath the remains of a downed plasma transport, her body barely protected by the fractured hull and a tangle of wiring that sparked feebly like veins of dying lightning. She was half conscious, her skin scorched, robes torn and blackened from fire. In her bloodied hand she still clutched a golden pin, a royal servant's crest, bent but unbroken. He didn't ask her name. He didn't ask who she served. He didn't even ask if she could understand him. He just reached in, pulled her out, and carried her on his back across the remains of a battlefield too dead for mercy. There was no medevac, no reinforcements, no command, only the remnants of a tan ration pack, a broken survival tent, and a moon full of dead things that would never rot. He sealed her wounds with heat foam and trauma gel, pressing his own jacket against her side to slow the bleeding. She moaned in a language he didn't know, and he answered in one he hoped she'd feel instead. You're not dying here, he whispered. Not like this. When she slipped into unconsciousness again, he didn't stop moving. He climbed a ridge with her weight on his shoulders and found an abandoned relay shack, long since stripped of parts. He patched the roof with his own armor plates and laid her gently on a blanket of old thermal mesh, brushing the soot from her face, careful not to smear the blood crusted at her temple. Her breathing was shallow, her pulse a flicker, but she was alive. He didn't know who she was, only that someone out there had already mourned her and that whoever buried her memory was wrong. Because here she was, small, broken, fierce in the stubborn way only survivors could be. And Corporal Mason Drew had made up his mind he would not let this girl die, even if the entire galaxy had already buried her. She woke screaming. The sound tore through the half-ruined shack like the war had never ended, her voice shrill and cracked from disuse, from dehydration, from pain buried too long inside her rib cage. Mason was at her side in an instant, holding her down gently, whispering something, anything, while she thrashed beneath the blanket of salvaged mesh. Her eyes were wild, unseen pupils jagged with terror, and the moment she felt his hands she went silent, rigid, frozen, like she was expecting death. Like she had already seen it and wasn't sure if this was the second coming. Mason lifted his hands immediately, stepping back, showing her he meant no harm. Hey, you're okay. You're not where you were. He swallowed hard. You're safe now. I got you out. Her lips barely moved. Her throat worked like she'd forgotten how to speak, but finally one word escaped. Queen. Mason paused. He crouched low, speaking softer. She's not here, but I think you were with her, weren't you? She nodded once, slow and weak. Her eyes began to fill with tears. He gave her water, just a sip, then another, and another. When her strength steadied, he helped her sit upright against the cracked wall and wrapped the warmer around her shoulders. She still trembled beneath it, not from cold, but from something much older. Guilt, fear, memory. I carried you out of the wreckage, he said. Took me 4 hours just to dig you free. You were under everything, metal, wires, fire, but you held on. I don't know how. Her voice came like a blade through gravel. I saw her fall. I tried to cover her, shield her. I failed. He shook his head. You didn't fail. You're still alive. Her hands tightened around the edge of the blanket. I shouldn't be. He exhaled. That's something we have in common. She looked at him, then really looked at him. The dirt across his jawline, the edge of a scar curling beneath his eye, the old Tehran badge on his chest plate. A human. The enemy once, but the only one who'd stayed. What's your name? She asked. Mason. You? Her eyes dropped to the sigil clutched in her hand. Her thumb ran across its scorched edge. Elin. He nodded. Nice to meet you, Elin. I think we're stuck with each other for a while. She didn't laugh, but she didn't cry either. That was progress. That night they stayed awake together, saying little. The storm outside howled across the ridgeline, rattling the beams of the shack, but the fire between them burned steady. Mason watched her as she leaned into the wall and let her eyes close, not in fear, but in the closest thing to rest she'd known since the palace fell. And in the silence that followed, he whispered a promise to no one in particular. I'll get you home. Far across the stars, in the high citadel of Velis Prime, Queen Iser stood before the council of stones with her chin high and her heart cracking behind her ribs. She had not spoken Ella's name in public since the war ended, since the fragments of her maid's robe had been found near that scorched grave in Atris Mere. To name her again in front of these cold-eyed nobles felt like breaking open a wound she'd only just managed to seal shut, but the pendant around her neck, the bondstone that had once pulsed in harmony with Elin's life force, had begun to flicker again, and she could not ignore it. The chamber was built of carved obsidian, its domed ceiling etched with the emblems of every house that had survived the burn. Lords and ladies sat in silence as Iser stepped forward, her long crimson cloak trailing behind her like a river of spilled wine. Her voice echoed through the stone hall as she raised the bondstone into the air. It stirs. A murmur ran through the nobles, skeptical and sharp. Your Majesty, said one Lord Taven, his words slow like poison. The bond could be reacting to residual memory, shadows that linger after death, not proof of survival. Iser's eyes snapped to his, bright with fury. I know what death feels like. I buried thousands. I carved the names of friends into black stone, and when Elin fell, my soul bled. This, she raised the stone again, is not mourning. This is heartbeat. The chamber fell silent again. She is out there, Iser continued, voice shaking now but not with doubt, with longing. She saved my life when the fire came through the gates. She threw herself between me and a plasma bolt that could melt bone. She dragged my body through the debris until I could flee, and for that you gave her a name on a rock and a grave no one visits. She was a maid, one of the younger counselors murmured, not unkindly, but too carefully. She was my sister in soul, the queen replied, and I will not let this galaxy rest until I know if she breathes. No one dared interrupt her after that. In private later that night, Iser stood alone on the balcony of her starlit chamber. She held the bondstone between her fingers, pressing it to her heart. A wind passed over the palace, carrying with it the scent of war-worn soil and blooming ricksweed flowers. Elaine used to sneak into her quarters when they were girls, hiding from their tutors. The scent made her eyes sting. She remembered the way Elaine had once brushed her hair before ceremonies, humming songs no noble ever learned. She remembered the quiet strength in her servants' hands as they steadied hers during political summits, and seen beneath the royal table, Ella had never worn gold, never sat at the queen's table, never spoken in council, but she had held more of Iser's heart than any minister alive. And now, with that bondstone flickering again in pulses too erratic to be random, Iser knew something had changed. Hope, fragile and wild, stirred inside her ribs like fire rising through old ash. She summoned the royal fleet. She gave the order herself, dispatch a ghost ship cloaked, fast, and armed to the outer systems of the Wraith Divide. She didn't tell the nobles. She didn't ask permission, because something in the stars had whispered the truth. Her maid was not dead, and the queen had every intention of proving it. By the third week in hiding, Elin had regained enough strength to stand barely. Her legs trembled like newborn limbs, thinner than they once were, still marked with the purple bruises of internal healing. But she refused to let Mason carry her anymore. Pride had survived what war could not kill. She was the shadow of a queen, after all, and shadows did not collapse before strangers, even human ones. Mason watched her carefully as she paced the cramped interior of the abandoned shack, one hand pressed to her side where her ribs still ached with every breath. He said nothing. He understood what it meant to let someone keep their dignity, especially when everything else had been burned away. Outside, the wind howled like something lost and angry. The mining moon was dead now, forgotten by both the Terran coalition and the remnants of the Eastern Crown worlds. Its riches long since bled dry, and its atmosphere barely breathable. But here, in this place of ash and silence, two survivors, one human, one alien, shared something not even diplomacy could name. I need to go back, Elin said, voice quiet. Mason looked up from the fire he was coaxing back to life. Back to where? To her. He knew who she meant, of course he did. She never said the queen's name aloud, not once, but everything in her eyes when she spoke of her burned with memories so sharp it could cut planets in half. You're not ready, Mason said gently. She shook her head. She thinks I'm dead. Everyone thinks you're dead. Her jaw clenched. She mourns alone, doesn't she? He didn't answer. Elin turned toward the doorway, staring out at the desolate moonscape, her arms folded tight against her chest. I served her since I was 10. I bathed her wounds when assassins broke through the southern gates. I buried her dog with my own hands when it died, and she couldn't stop crying. I was with her when she bled in the fire. Mason stood slowly, walking to stand beside her. And when I opened my eyes here, she whispered, I thought I died, and this was some kind of cruel limbo. Mason glanced at her. Maybe it was. She smiled faintly. Then you must be my punishment. He laughed once, just enough to let her know she wasn't wrong. I've been called worse. They stood in silence, the two of them shadows against the doorway of a world no one wanted. Her profile caught the red glow of the dying sky as she reached into the folds of her sleeve and removed the bent sigil, the royal servant's crest. She'd kept it hidden even from him, close to her skin like a relic of faith. She turned it slowly between her fingers. She wore the other half, she said. I made these when we were young, split from the same metal. If hers still glows. Her voice faltered. Then she's alive too, and mourning a ghost. Mason looked at the crest, then at her. I'm going to take you home, he said. She turned to him. Why? He didn't look away. Because the galaxy is a graveyard of people who didn't get the chance to return. You shouldn't be one of them. She watched him for a long moment, then finally nodded once. And for the first time, something inside her, something buried beneath duty and pain, began to breathe again. Yira sat in her starlit chamber, wrapped in robes too heavy for comfort, her crown discarded beside the bed she hadn't worn it in 3 days, not since the bondstone began to pulse again. It did so at odd hours, never consistent, never predictable, like a heartbeat struggling to remember its rhythm. She kept it beside her skin, resting just beneath the hollow of her throat, and every time it lit up, her hand flew to it like instinct. She'd stopped telling her guards, stopped explaining it to the ministers and the physicians and the soothsayers. They all said the same thing: phantom reaction, neural imprint, trauma, nothing more. But Yira knew Ellen, and Elaine had never done anything halfway. Tonight, as the moons passed directly over the royal spire, the bondstone flared again, brighter than before, sharp and urgent, like it was being called. Yira sat up straight, her breath catching in her throat. For a heartbeat, She was no longer the queen of a rebuilt nation. She was just a woman missing someone who'd been more than a friend, more than a servant. She closed her eyes, and for a moment she could smell the oils Elin used when preparing the ceremonial bath, hear the soft songs she would hum while brushing the queen's hair, the scent of warmed linens, the echo of bare footsteps across obsidian tile. So many little things, now gone but not gone, not truly. She moved to the edge of the chamber and touched the wall, activating the long-range private comms relay, an ancient encrypted channel Ellen used to monitor palace corridors during lockdowns. It had not been touched in over a year. She spoke one word into it, her voice barely audible. Elin. The line crackled with static, then silence. She lowered her head, eyes burning, and prepared to close it again. But something answered, not a voice, not a message, a single sharp pulse. 3 beeps echoing from the void. Her eyes flew open. That was the code, their private code. 1 pulse for alive, 2 for safe, 3 for homebound. She staggered backward, pressing the bond stone to her heart, unable to breathe, unable to speak. Elin was alive. The bond wasn't broken. The stars themselves hadn't taken her. A soldier had saved her, and that meant one thing only. Yira had to find him, not for revenge, not for interrogation, but to thank the one soul in this broken galaxy who had carried her shadow through the fire and into the light. And nothing, not court protocol, not planetary law, not even the ghosts of war would stop her from bringing Elin home. They left the dead moon on a vessel older than either of them trusted. Mason had scoured the crash yard for weeks before finding a working core in a gutted scout frigate, its original crew long since gone, its hull half-eaten by time and rust. But Elin insisted she help restore it. She moved through the wreck like someone remembering an old prayer, fingers caressing broken consoles, rerouting power like she'd done in the royal palace before war turned her hands to ash and blood. Mason watched her with a strange mix of awe and sorrow. She'd been royalty's shadow, a servant trained to fade, yet in the chaos of ruin, she rose. Her voice grew stronger each day, her posture straightened, and her eyes no longer flicked toward the door as if expecting it to explode. Ella was remembering herself not as the maid who died, but the one who refused to. When the ship finally took flight, the stars greeted them like old friends. The nav system wheezed and the artificial gravity flickered every few hours, but they had trajectory. They were heading home, back to Ellerin. Neither of them slept. Elaine spent most of the voyage pacing the corridor just outside the bridge, practicing what she'd say to her queen. How do you speak to someone who thinks you've been ashes for a year? How do you stand tall before a woman who once knelt beside your bed to wash blood from your scalp and whispered you'd never be left behind? Mason didn't interrupt her. He sat in the cockpit, helmet off, listening to the soft hum of a girl trying to reclaim her voice. Then, 2 days from orbit, a fleet intercepted them. 7 ships of the Royal Guard, polished silver hulls, crest banners illuminated by the light of twin suns. They moved like phantoms, surrounding the tiny frigate in a formation so precise Mason's fingers flew to weapons control before he could think. But Elin placed her hand over his. No, he paused. She stood slowly, walked to the comms unit, and activated the external channel. This is Elin of the Royal House, she said, first hand to Queen Iser. I am returning alive. The silence that followed felt like it could split the stars. Then came the voice of the fleet commander, brittle and choked with disbelief. Impossible. You died at Atris. We buried you. I wasn't ready, she said simply. A moment later, one of the ships lowered its boarding ramp, and the rest peeled back, leaving a corridor in space wide enough for Mason to pass through. As Mason guided the small ship forward, Elin didn't shake or cry. She stood in the center of the bridge like a crownless queen returning from the underworld. And even the Tehran soldier, battle-scarred and unwelcome, felt the stars hold their breath. Queen Iser didn't wait for protocol. She was already in the hangar bay when the ramp lowered, her court far behind, scrambling to catch up with her unannounced descent. The crown was gone from her head, her ceremonial robes had been discarded for simple attire, and her eyes burned with sleepless nights and kindled fury searched every shadow cast by the rising boarding ramp. Then there she was, Elin, paler, thinner, wounded in ways even healing crystals could not mend, but her stance held the same gravity it had always had. Quiet, defiant, loyal. Iser didn't walk to her. She ran. And before any minister, before any herald could speak a word, the queen threw her arms around the woman the galaxy had buried. Elin staggered forward as if gravity itself remembered her, and for a breathless moment there were no titles, no crowns, no war, only two women who had mourned each other from opposite ends of a grave that never truly held either of them. The silence in the hangar was thick with disbelief. Some of the nobles gasped, a few guards dropped to their knees, and Mason, still standing at the foot of the ramp, watched it all without stepping forward. He didn't belong in that moment, he wasn't the returning soul. But then Yira turned, her arms still around Elin. She walked toward the soldier, her gaze slow, deliberate. Everyone in the hangar followed her with wide eyes, as if they expected her to denounce him, to question him, to raise judgment. She stopped in front of him, looked him in the eye, and bowed not deep, but low enough for the galaxy to never forget. "You carried my heart through the storm," she said. "You brought her back when I thought she was lost to smoke and ruin. No one, no warrior, no royal has ever done so much for my soul." Mason stared, stunned. "I was just doing what felt right." She smiled sadly. "That is what makes it sacred." Behind her, Elaine finally let her tears fall, but they weren't tears of grief. They were tears that marked the closing of a wound. For the first time since the sky fell in fire, she stood where she belonged, alive, seen, and not forgotten. The queen extended her hand to Mason, and he took it not as a soldier, but as a man who had defied death, silence, and a galaxy's forgetting, simply to keep a promise that had never been his to make. The palace smelled different now. Elaine walked through its long corridors with bare feet, no longer wrapped in bloodied robes or Tehran thermal sheets, but in clean cloth of royal gray, neither servant nor noble. Her footsteps echoed like a memory being reborn with every stride. A ghost weaving herself back into the world that had already mourned her twice. Servants paused and stared as she passed. Soldiers, those who had once marched past her without notice, now stood a little straighter, some unsure whether to salute or bow. But Ellen didn't look at them. She looked at the walls, the ones she used to clean by hand when she was younger, the corners where she used to hide after court banquets, the stairwells she climbed while cradling Iser's sobs after council betrayals. The palace hadn't changed, but she had. And somewhere deep in her bones, she could feel the weight of a woman who no longer lived in the shadows of royalty, but carried a light of her own. Yira waited in the throne room, not seated, but standing at the base of the steps, crown in hand. Her eyes hollowed by too many sleepless nights and too many speeches to people she no longer trusted. When Ellen stepped into the great chamber, they didn't speak, not at first. Iser simply opened her arms, and Elin, this time, didn't hesitate. They held each other without formality, no eyes raised above them, no court to judge, no generals to advise. Just two women who had walked through fire for each other, one a queen, one a servant, but both forged in the same crucible of loss. "You were always more than what they called you," Iser whispered into her hair. "And you were never alone," Elin replied. Mason stood just inside the doors, watching silently. He had declined the golden armor they offered him. He wore his old Tehran fatigues, patched and soot-stained, the same ones he'd used to wrap her wounds. A dozen officials waited to interrogate him politely, of course, but the queen had declared the chamber sealed. No questions, no demands, only gratitude. She approached him as if reuniting with a brother instead of a stranger who'd stumbled into her galaxy. "You didn't just save a life," she told him. "You corrected a lie. You returned to me something that can't be replaced." "What do you want?" Mason drew. He hesitated. "I want nothing," he said quietly. "She's home. That's enough." Yira nodded, but her gaze didn't leave him. "You'll have a place here if you want it. You may leave if you must, but this house will never forget you." He offered a crooked smile, then looked to Ellen. She met his eyes, and for a moment they said everything words never could. The look between those who had seen each other at their worst and still believed in what was left. Weeks passed. The queen resumed her court, but no longer with the same stillness. She stood taller now, more centered. The nobles whispered of her change, not in strategy or policy, but in presence. Her grief had not vanished, but it no longer ruled her. Elin no longer served meals. She sat beside the queen during evening discussions. She advised in private. She laughed in the sun again. And when she walked through the gardens each morning, barefoot among the dawn-kissed ricksweed blossoms, she didn't think of death, she thought of him. Mason stayed longer than anyone expected, not for the throne or rewards, but because the palace, oddly enough, began to feel like peace. He helped rebuild the East Wing's broken generator core. He shared Terran medical techniques with the alien healers. And on quiet nights, He and Elin walked the outer walls, speaking not of war but of memory, on the first official day of peace. Celebrations, Queen Iser gathered her council and made a statement that would echo across star systems. The war stole many things. Let it not steal the truth of those who endured it. She raised the twin sigils, hers and Elin's reunited at last, and with one hand she placed them in the Hall of Flames, where names of heroes were etched not by bloodline but by sacrifice. When asked later by an Ellerin historian what Mason Drew had truly done to earn such reverence, the queen answered with a smile, "He carried what I could not through ruin, through fire, through grief." And what did she mean to you? They asked of Elin. Yr's smile faded to something quieter, more sacred. She was my shadow and my light. And that day, under 1,000 banners, the galaxy didn't mourn, it remembered.